My husband's family flew to Costa Rica the same morning I delivered our baby alone in a Calgary hospital. They knew my due date, they had known for months, and they went anyway. I don't say that to make anyone feel sorry for me. I say it because for a long time, I convinced myself it wasn't as bad as it sounded. I told myself they had reasons. I made excuses for them the way you do when the alternative, accepting that the people who are supposed to love you simply don't prioritize you, is too painful to sit with. What I didn't know was that my grandmother had been watching everything, and she had been keeping records. My name is Noelle Ashford. I was 31 when I gave birth to my daughter, and the person who held my hand through 14 hours of labor was not my mother-in-law, not my sister-in-law, not my husband's brother. It was my grandmother, who drove 3 hours from Red Deer in February, in the dark, through a snowstorm, because I called her at 2 in the morning and she didn't hesitate for a single second. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My husband, whom I'll call by his role in this story, my husband, had a large, close-sounding family. That was always how they described themselves. Close, tight-knit. The kind of family that used those words constantly, at every gathering, in every card. They talked about togetherness the way people talk about a religion they've stopped practicing, but still believe in theoretically. His younger brother, the one everyone treated like he'd been assembled from spare parts of everyone's favorite qualities, had been planning a trip to Costa Rica with his girlfriend for most of the year. His parents had decided to join them sometime in October. My sister-in-law was going too. It became a family trip. 8 days, a resort near Tamarindo, organized around the brothers' schedule because everything in that family was organized around the brothers' schedule. My due date was February 14th. Not a guess. Not an estimate that could have been off by weeks. My OB had confirmed it twice. Everyone knew. When I was about 7 months along, I gently brought up the trip at a Sunday dinner. I wasn't asking them to cancel. I was asking whether they had thought about the timing. I said it calmly. I even smiled when I said it, because I had learned early in my relationship that raising anything that could be perceived as a complaint required careful presentation. My mother-in-law said the flights were non-refundable. My father-in-law said babies rarely arrive exactly on their due date, which is technically true and entirely beside the point. My brother-in-law said he was sure everything would be fine, and then changed the subject to the resort's ziplining package. My husband looked at the table. I drove home that night in silence, telling myself that surely something would shift closer to the date. Surely when it became real. When I was actually 38 weeks pregnant, and they were packing their bags, someone would reconsider. Nobody reconsidered. They left on February 9th. My husband drove them to the airport. He came home, smelling like the coffee shop in Departures, and said his mom had cried a little at the gate, which he seemed to think was meaningful. I was on the couch with my feet up, too tired to respond. 5 days later, my water broke at 4:47 in the morning. My husband was there. I want to be clear about that. He was there and he was trying. But there is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from going through something enormous with a person who is present in body but quietly somewhere else. He kept checking his phone. Not constantly, he wasn't cruel about it, but enough that I noticed. Enough that it registered, in the spaces between contractions, as a particular kind of absence. I called my grandmother from the triage room. I didn't even plan to. My fingers just found her number. She answered on the second ring. I told her I was at the foothills and that everything was progressing, and that I was okay, and before I could say anything else she told me she was already getting her coat. I tried to tell her the roads were bad. She said she'd driven worse. She said, "I'll be there before you need me," and she was right. She arrived at 7:30 in the morning, still wearing her wool driving coat, carrying a thermos of tea she'd made at home, and a small bag she must have packed the moment she knew I was close. She found me in the labor room, squeezed my hand, and didn't say much. She didn't need to. There are people whose presence is its own complete sentence, and my grandmother is one of them. My daughter was born at 6:18 that evening. My grandmother was holding my hand. My husband was on my other side. The first photos from that room are the three of us. My grandmother looking exhausted and radiant at the same time, my husband tearful, and my daughter making a face that looked vaguely annoyed at the whole situation. The first message from my in-laws arrived 40 minutes later. A thumbs up emoji, and "Congratulations, so happy for you both, enjoy this time." My mother-in-law's follow-up said they were at dinner and would call tomorrow. My brother-in-law sent a picture of a sunset and said the baby shared good taste and timing. My grandmother read those messages over my shoulder and didn't say a word. She just quietly set my phone face down on the bedside table and asked if I wanted more tea. The days that followed were the hardest of my life, and I say that as someone who has had hard days. Postpartum recovery is not gentle under the best circumstances. I had needed stitches. I was trying to breastfeed and struggling. My daughter had lost a bit too much weight in her first days, and we were monitoring carefully, which meant I was up every 2 hours through the night, logging feeds on a hospital app, crying in the dark for reasons I couldn't always name. My grandmother stayed. She slept on the pull-out chair in the hospital room the first night without being asked. When we came home, she drove behind us and stayed another 4 days, making soup, handling laundry, getting up with me at 2 and 4 in the morning, so I wasn't alone in the kitchen, half delirious, trying to remember which breast I'd started on. Meanwhile, my in-laws were snorkeling. They were taking a cooking class. They were posting photos from a rooftop restaurant with a caption about golden hour. They didn't call for 3 days. When my mother-in-law finally did call, the first thing she asked was whether I'd been drinking enough water, which would have been thoughtful if it hadn't been followed immediately by a 15-minute description of a waterfall they'd hiked to that morning. I held the phone slightly away from my ear and watched my grandmother, across the room, quietly folding baby laundry, and I had the strange sensation of seeing, very clearly, who was actually in my life. They extended the trip. I found out from my husband, who mentioned it the way you mentioned something you've been putting off mentioning. Quickly, while doing something else, not quite meeting my eyes. His brother had found a deal on an extra 3 nights. The parents had agreed it was too good to pass up. They'd be home a week later than originally planned. I was 10 days postpartum. I had a new baby with a weight check in 2 days. My husband was back at work. He'd used his parental leave days efficiently, and I didn't want to ask for more, and his entire family had decided that a resort deal was worth the extension. My grandmother was standing at the kitchen counter when my husband told me. I saw her shoulders tighten slightly, just slightly, but she didn't turn around, and she didn't say anything until he'd left the room. Then she looked at me for a long moment and said, "How are you feeling about that?" I said I was fine. She nodded slowly, like she understood that fine wasn't actually what I meant, and she opened the notes app on her phone and typed something quietly before putting it back in her pocket. I noticed her doing that more over the following weeks, taking out her phone after conversations, after messages arrived, after interactions with my husband's family that left a particular residue. At the time, I thought she was texting her friends or keeping a grocery list. My grandmother has always been organized in ways that seemed slightly miraculous. I didn't ask questions. When my in-laws finally came home, 12 days after my daughter was born, they arrived at our house in Kensington with gifts from the resort gift shop and enormous enthusiasm about a trip that had by then become something I struggled to think about neutrally. My mother-in-law held the baby for 40 minutes and talked almost entirely about Costa Rica. She talked about the food, the humidity, a boat tour they'd taken, a restaurant recommendation someone had given them. She talked about what the sunsets looked like from their room. She did not ask about the birth, not once. Not how long labor had been, not whether it had been difficult, not how I was healing, not how I was sleeping. She asked if the baby had my husband's ears, which was apparently something she'd been wondering about. My father-in-law patted my shoulder when he arrived and said, "You look great," which is something people say to new mothers when they want to say something but don't know what. My brother-in-law came by later in the week and showed me vacation photos on his phone, which included many photos of himself and his girlfriend in various scenic locations, and one photo of a sloth. My grandmother, who had come over that afternoon, sat across from me at the kitchen table and watched the whole thing with the particular expression she gets when she is cataloging something. That evening, after everyone had left, she helped me settle the baby, and we sat together in my kitchen, with the lights low. She said, "You know you didn't imagine any of this." I hadn't realized I needed to hear that until she said it. "People tell you who they are," she said. "Be what they show up for." She took out her phone and typed something. I noticed she already had a folder open. Months passed. My daughter grew. I went back to work part-time, then full-time. I got better at sleeping in fragments. I stopped expecting my in-laws to ask about the birth, and once I stopped expecting it, things became easier in a surface-level way. We could sit through Sunday dinners without the specific tension of an unaddressed thing. But something had changed in me. I knew what I knew, and I'd stopped pretending otherwise. My grandmother, during this time, was unusually occupied. Whenever I visited her in Red Deer, she had papers spread on her dining room table. Printed emails, notes in her careful handwriting, things I couldn't quite make out before she gathered them. She told me she was organizing old family records, which was plausible enough that I believed her. What I didn't know was that she had spent those months building something much more thorough than a record of the Costa Rica trip. She had gone back further. She had pulled up old emails between herself and my mother-in-law from the year my husband and I got engaged. She had found messages from my husband's parents to other family members, forwarded to her over the years by various relatives, in which I was described in terms that were politely diminishing. She had assembled birthday messages, holiday messages, a documented pattern of my sister-in-law being consulted about major family decisions while I was informed of them afterward. She had compared how my brother-in-law's long-term girlfriend, now his fiancée, was spoken about versus how I was spoken about at family gatherings, in family group chats, in the casual language of how the family told its own story to itself. I was always adjacent. His brother's girlfriend, now fiancée, was central. The more my grandmother looked, the more she found. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something more habitual than that. It was a family that had decided, long before I arrived, who mattered most and had simply continued operating that way. In the spring, my brother-in-law got engaged. The proposal was elaborate and planned over months and involved his girlfriend's entire family flown in from Halifax. It was lovely, genuinely. I wasn't begrudging anyone that. But the engagement party planning started immediately, and it was the first time I saw what close family actually meant when they meant it. Every weekend became a planning session. My mother-in-law called my husband daily. His father started a group chat for venues. His sister flew in from Vancouver just to visit possible caterers. The energy in that family transformed. Suddenly everyone was present, engaged, enthusiastic, texting back within minutes. My daughter's first birthday was that same spring. I mentioned it once in the family group chat. 3 people reacted with a heart emoji. No one asked about plans. My grandmother came down from Red Deer with balloons and a cake she'd baked from scratch and a small photo album she'd put together of my daughter's first year. She was the only one who remembered that my daughter had taken her first steps 2 weeks earlier and mentioned it to my daughter directly, the way you talk to a 1-year-old you've been paying attention to. At the birthday party, which was small, close friends and my grandmother and my husband, I caught my grandmother in the kitchen, taking photos of a text exchange on her phone. When I walked in, she looked up, not embarrassed exactly, but deliberate. She held my gaze for a moment, then said, "Your mother-in-law sent her regards." I hadn't seen a message. She did, my grandmother said. "Just now. I have it." I didn't ask what she meant by that. Something about her tone told me not to. That autumn, my in-laws announced they were throwing a large family gathering to celebrate their 40th wedding anniversary. The event was going to be held at a ballroom in a hotel in downtown Calgary, the kind of venue that requires a minimum head count and a deposit months in advance. My mother-in-law described it as the celebration they'd always wanted, an evening for everyone who had been part of their story. I had no particular interest in attending. I was still carrying everything from the past year and a half in a way I hadn't fully sorted through. And the idea of spending an evening performing normalcy in a ballroom while my in-laws accepted congratulations on what a wonderful family they'd built felt genuinely exhausting. I declined the first conversation about it. Then my grandmother called. She sounded like herself, measured, warm, no urgency in her voice. But she said, "I think you should be at that anniversary dinner." I told her I wasn't sure I could manage a whole evening of it. She listened to everything I said. Then she said, "I'd like you to be there. I think it matters that you're there. There are going to be people in that room who should see you." That last part was unusual enough that I paused. "What are you planning?" I asked her. She was quiet for a beat. "I'm going to make sure some things get said that should have been said a long time ago," she told me. "And I'd like you to be there when they are." I said I'd come. The weeks before the anniversary felt charged in a way I couldn't locate the source of. My grandmother seemed calm, but it was the specific calm of someone who has made a decision and is simply waiting for the right moment. She made one trip to Calgary in that period to drop off a folder at her lawyer's office, which she mentioned in passing and declined to explain. I didn't push. My in-laws, meanwhile, were in the full current of celebration planning. Guest lists, seating arrangements, a video montage of family photos my mother-in-law had spent weeks assembling. She texted my husband almost daily with updates. The theme was 40 years of love and family. His brother's fiancée was helping coordinate the florals. I helped with nothing and was asked about nothing, which was so consistent with the previous 3 years that I barely noticed it until I did. The night of the anniversary arrived cold and clear, the way late October gets in Calgary when the sky empties out and everything looks very sharp and far away. The hotel ballroom was arranged with round tables and tall centerpieces and photographs from the past 4 decades displayed on easels around the perimeter. My in-laws stood near the entrance greeting guests. They looked happy. I thought, watching them, that they probably were happy. That was part of what made this complicated. They weren't villains. They were people who had spent 40 years believing a particular story about themselves, without anyone having adequately challenged it. My grandmother arrived after I did. She was wearing the gray wool blazer she saves for occasions that require dignity, and she had a leather folder tucked under one arm. She found me at our table, squeezed my hand and said only, "You all right?" Somehow, dinner was served, wine was poured, toasts were given. My father-in-law spoke about meeting his wife at a university orientation weekend in Kingston in 1984. My brother-in-law gave a toast that was genuinely funny and warm, and reflected the fact that he had always been the golden version of the family's idea of itself. Other relatives spoke. It was a pleasant evening, measured against the standard of such evenings. Then my grandmother stood up. Nobody expected it. She wasn't on the program. She simply stood, and the room, about 70 people, shifted its attention toward her the way rooms do when someone with a certain quality commands them without asking for it. She's 81 years old and she has that quality completely. She thanked my in-laws for their 40 years together. She said something gracious about marriage, as an act of daily decision-making, that she found genuinely admirable. She said she'd known this family for 4 years and had always taken their description of themselves at face value. A tight-knit family, a close family, a family that showed up for each other. Then she opened her folder. "I'd like to read some things aloud," she said, "because I believe honesty is more respectful than silence, and I am too old to choose silence about something that matters." The room was not exactly quiet. It was the specific quality of attention that is the opposite of quiet. She started with the morning my daughter was born. She read the timestamp of the thumbs-up emoji. She read my mother-in-law's message saying they were at dinner. She read my brother-in-law's sunset message. She noted the time, 40 minutes after my granddaughter's birth. Then she read the time of their next contact, 3 days later. She read the message about extending the trip. She read it slowly, so that everyone in the room had time to understand what it said. She described, without dramatics, what those 12 days had looked like from where she had been sitting, the 3 a.m. drives from Red Deer, the hospital chair, the laundry, the weight check, the feeds I was logging in the dark. Not for sympathy, she said clearly, but because she believed the people in this room deserved a complete picture. Then she went further back. She read from the emails she had been forwarded over the years, messages in which I was described, by my mother-in-law, in ways that were careful and deniable but, taken together, formed something coherent. She presented the pattern she'd documented, the decisions made without my input, the gatherings organized around his brother's schedule, the comparison in how I was spoken about versus how his brother's fiancé was spoken about within the same family conversations. She was not angry. She never raised her voice. She simply read the record she had assembled over 4 years, in the same tone she might use to read a legal document, which is perhaps what it was. The room went very still. My mother-in-law stood up partway through and said my grandmother was misinterpreting things. My father-in-law said she was embarrassing herself. My grandmother looked at them both with the patience of someone who has already accounted for this response and said, "I have the original messages with me. I'm happy to make them available to anyone who would like to compare." Nobody moved to stop her. The questions started from the edges of the room. An aunt of my husband's, someone I'd met twice, asked why nobody had flown home when I went into labor. A cousin asked about the trip extension. A family friend who had known my in-laws for 30 years said, quietly, that she had noticed things over the years that she had never felt she could name. My sister-in-law, to her credit, said nothing in her parents' defense, and later came to find me near the coat check and said she was sorry. She said she had known something was wrong and hadn't said anything and she was sorry. I believed her. My brother-in-law tried to explain himself. The explanations made things worse. Several people in the room nodded slowly, not the nod of agreement, but the nod of a thing confirming itself. I sat through all of it without speaking. I didn't need to. My grandmother had said what needed to be said, and she had the documentation to back every word of it. The story my in-laws had told about their family for 4 decades, the closeness, the togetherness, the tight-knit, was visible now in a different light. And once you see something in that light, you can't return to the previous version. When my grandmother sat back down, she put her hand over mine and didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. What had needed to happen had happened, and we both knew it. The aftermath was long and not simple. My in-laws called my husband many times in the following weeks. They called me once to say they felt they had been publicly humiliated, which they had been, and that my grandmother had behaved outrageously, and I listened, and then said that I thought she had behaved with considerable restraint given the material she had, and that seemed to end the call. My brother-in-law sent me an email 3 weeks later. It was longer than anything he'd sent me before, which set a low bar, but it was genuine. He said he had spent his life being treated as the priority, and had accepted it without examining what that meant for me. He said he was examining it now. I wrote back that I appreciated the email, and that I hoped we could build something more honest going forward. I meant it. My in-laws' relationship with my husband became more complicated, not broken, but recalibrated. He had his own reckoning to do, and that part of the story belongs to him. What I can say is that he came to me one evening after a long phone call with his father and said, "I think I've been looking the other way about a lot of things." And I said, "I think you have too," and we talked for a long time after that. My grandmother went back to Red Deer and, as far as I know, put her files away. I visited her in December, a few weeks before Christmas. My daughter was almost 2 by then and was extremely interested in my grandmother's cat, which is elderly and patient and tolerates considerable enthusiasm. We sat at the kitchen table while my daughter investigated the cat and had tea the way we always do, in the good cups with the good biscuits, because my grandmother believes in using the good things. I told her I didn't know how to thank her. She told me I didn't need to. She said she had spent 81 years watching people look the other way about things that mattered, and she had decided some years ago that she was too old and too tired to keep doing it. The truth was all there, she said, nodding toward the living room, toward nothing in particular. It just needed someone to gather it. I looked at her, this woman who drove in the dark in February without being asked, who slept in a hospital chair, who typed quietly into her phone for 18 months and then stood up in a ballroom with a leather folder and did not waver. And I understood something I might have known for a while, but was only now fully ready to receive. Family is not the people who say they will always be there. It is the people who are already there before you think to ask.